Hi, John Hess from Filmmaker, IQ. It's been over 5 years since my defending 24 FPS video took off. 500,000 views, 9,000 comments later, I'm still talking about this subject. It seems like anytime I talk about frame rate, I get way more views than normal, thank you to the YouTube algorithm. So here I am, hopefully giving my overlords exactly what they want. And you wonder why the movie theaters are full of sequels and franchises. But this won't be the same frame rate discussion. I won't even talk about 24 FPS today, as I'm dipping my toe into the world of biology and psychophysics. Let's revisit this portion of my original video from long ago that a lot of people misunderstood.
Number 5, I can see 144 frames per second. No, you can't. Again, we bump into the fetishization of technology. There are a lot of kids saying how they can spot some super high, ridiculous frame rate. But the truth is the human eye doesn't work that way. Humans are analog creatures. We don't sample or quantize or pixelate our vision.
Now to reiterate, no, your eye does not see 144 frames per second. The eye and the connected human visual system have no real frame rate, at least not the way we understand in terms of video and motion picture film. So that's it. The answer to the clickbaity title of this video is none. There is no frame rate. It doesn't exist because the eye does not see in a frame rate. Remember that statement because that's going to be today's mantra. However, there are some rather interesting phenomena that do rise up in the realm of frame rate and human vision. So if we absolutely had to give human vision some sort of asterisk-laden frame rate, that frame rate could be 10 frames a second. Now I realize some of you gamers just threw up in your mouth a little bit. Just remember though, the eye does not see in a frame rate. This is what happens when you apply a video camera model to something biologically complex as the human eye. It doesn't work that way. Okay, before I get to explaining that 10 FPS, I'm going to wipe the slate clean and crush two exceedingly basic myths about frame rate and the human eye that probably many of you are immediately reaching for as a rebuttal. Myth number 1, fighter pilots are able to identify enemy aircraft when exposed to only an image flashed at 1/220th of a second. Therefore, the eye can see at least 220 FPS. Now, this story has been floating around so long in internet forums about frame rate that it's hard to find the exact study that showed this or even what that exact number was. But that doesn't really matter. I don't doubt it's possible. Fighter pilots have exquisite vision by selection and extremely well-honed reflexes, but the conclusion is faulty. Just because you can see a flash at a short duration doesn't mean your eye has the frame rate equal to the speed of that flash. Now, flash photographers know this intuitively. A studio flashbulb burst is anywhere between 1/400th of a second down to 1/20,000th of a second, depending on the power. Now, this one is an older, cheaper model rated for 1/800th of a second. If I record a video at 24 frames a second using a 360-degree shutter, you can clearly see the flash. So using a camera recording at an objectively 24 frames per second frame rate, we can detect and record an 800th of a second flash. In fact, I can detect a flash using a camera running any frame rate per second, so long as the shutter is open during the flash. On the flip side, I could use a camera shooting 1,000,000 frames a second and detect that flash over a series of frames. So long as the photons are registered by the camera sensor when the shutter is open, the sampling rate or the frame rate doesn't matter. Being able to see a flash does not in any way determine the frame rate of the recording medium or the frame rate of the human eye. Myth number 2, I can tell the difference between a 60 Hz display and a 144 Hz display. Therefore, the eye is at least capable of seeing 144 FPS. This one I get constantly. Yes, you can tell the difference between a 60 Hz and a 144 Hz display, but that says more about the way motion pictures are created on a screen than it does about human biology. Now first, no one can tell the difference by looking at a still image. You need motion, and the most basic way people notice the refresh rate of a monitor is by wiggling their mouse around. But here's the key point. When you move your cursor around the screen, nothing actually moves. The motion of a screen is instead a rapid succession of still images, each a little different than the previous one. This is called apparent motion by psychologists. Remember that it is the illusion of movement, not actual movement. Apparent as in seemingly real or true, but not necessarily so. When you wiggle a cursor around a screen very quickly, the images of the mouse create a phantom array of cursors. With 60 Hz, 60 instances of the cursor are generated every second. With 144 Hz, obviously 144 instances are created every second. And yes, you can absolutely tell the difference between 60 and 144 cursors per second. But before you congratulate yourself for such an observational feat, so can a camera shooting 24 frames per second. This video is 24 frames per second using a 360-degree shutter. And on the right, you see a cursor wiggling at 60 Hz. And on the left, you see a cursor wiggling at 144 Hz. If we freeze the frame, we can see 2 and a faint cursor's images in the 60 Hz monitor, and 6 distinct cursors with 1 faint one in the 144 Hz monitor. So even a 24 FPS camera can tell the difference. And just like the flash demonstration before, any camera shooting any frame rate will detect the difference. A lower frame rate will record different multiples of the cursor, and a higher frame rate will record a single cursor for multiple frames. So right off the bat, both of those exceedingly common myths I hear over and over again tell us nothing about human perception, because neither understands the basic tenets of exposure and photography. So now what? Well, this would be a good time to repeat my mantra. The human eye does not have a frame rate. But there are some interesting numbers still worth talking about. And let's start with the one that sounds the most objectionable. 10 Hertz. Yes, you heard that right. 10 Hertz or 10 frames per second. Even before movies became a thing, Gestalt psychology found that 10 to 12 frames is where the phenomenon of apparent motion begins. Be it phi phenomenon or beta movement, the distinction would fill up another video all on its own. The idea is that after 10 to 12 frames per second, the succession of images becomes apparent motion, whether that's 15 frames, 24 frames, or 2400 frames. It's all motion, but motion with different levels of fluidity. But I'm going to come at it with another non-psychological, somewhat more biological angle, that of Bloch's law. Now, quick bit of humble pie here. I'm going to approach Bloch's law in a unique way that may not be exactly up to speed with current scientific literature. There's some revision going on right now about it. Take to the comments if you want to see me get chewed out on it, but whatever. Here goes. A while ago, I was trying to devise a visual experiment to see if I could detect the judder of 3:2 pull down. That is the process by which we show 24 frames per second inside a 60 FPS stream. So I create a series of chasing dots. One dot would display for 3 frames of 60 frames per second. The next would be 2 frames, and 3, and 2, and alternate, so forth. So you should be able to see a kind of a swing pattern in the pull down, right? Well, when I ran the experiment, I found something I didn't expect. Something completely different. I didn't see one dot after the other. Instead, I saw 3 dots chasing down the line. Now, this shouldn't be that big a surprise, because just like the wiggling cursors, the dots were generating a phantom array. Now, you might call it persistence of vision, but if you dig down that rabbit hole, persistence of vision is a mess of different phenomena. Digging further, I came across something called Bloch's law. Proposed in 1885, Adolf Moisey Bloch, I'm sure I mispronounced that, asked the question, is there a relationship between the perceived brightness and the duration of the light? He found that below a certain critical duration, the duration of the exposure and the perceived brightness of the light were reciprocal. In other words, if you half the duration of light below a critical duration, you will half the perceived brightness. Now, that's not news to folks who work with cameras and shutter speeds, but let's investigate this further. If you stare at a candle for 2 seconds, and then you stare at a candle for 1 second, you're not going to notice any difference in brightness. This reciprocal only happens when the duration is very short, and the number that Bloch and others found was about 100 milliseconds. That's 1/10 of a second. So under 100 milliseconds, the duration and brightness are a product. At the risk of oversimplification, it's as if the eye has a shutter speed of 100 milliseconds, or 1/10 of a second. Let's do a quick basic experiment here on this video. I'm going to flash that same image of a candle. Only on the left, I will flash it for 1 frame. And on the right, I will flash it for 2 frames. Now, if you're prone to epileptic seizures from light, you should look away now. I'll tell you when it's clear. Here we go. Since this video is 24 frames a second, a single frame is 42 milliseconds. So 3 frames is 126 milliseconds. Now you might be able to sense that the image on the right is a bit longer, but you should also sense that it feels a little bit brighter, even though they are the exact same brightness. But this phenomenon doesn't happen if I raise the duration of the images to 3 frames and 6 frames. Okay, no more flashing images. You can look back now. With Bloch's law in mind, remember that fighter pilot experiment I talked about earlier? You could reduce the duration of that flash as much as you want, as long as you increase the brightness by the same amount. The flash will be perceived just as bright. Now, obviously, it's a little bit messier than that, but that's the gist of Bloch's law. So in essence, the eye has a shutter speed of 1/10 of a second. And since you can't have a shutter speed longer than the frame rate, and please don't make me have to argue that in the comments. I've actually had to argue that, and it's just like, why? The human eye, therefore, has a frame rate of 10 frames per second. Right? So we're done. No, that's just silly. Remember our mantra. Human vision has no frame rate. You can't apply a model of a camera to the biology of the human eye. Besides, Bloch's law may only apply to individual cells of the eye, or clusters of rods and cones. Unlike a camera, the cells in your eyes aren't attached to a master clock that syncs and samples all the retinal cells all at one time. Those cells are always firing, or sometimes bundled to detect certain visual details like motion or edge detail. Remember, the eye has no frame rate. The eye is not a camera. So let's get on to the next interesting number. 50 to 90 hertz. This is the flicker fusion threshold in humans, also called critical flicker fusion. This is the rate at which a strobing light no longer looks like it's flickering, but looks like it's continuously on. And our modern technological world is full of strobing lights, from fluorescent light bulbs to pulse width modulation dimmed LEDs. It's all flickering, and our organic eyes cannot sense it. The ability to detect flicker is based on a large number of factors. I've gone over it in at least 3 other videos, but here's a quick rundown again. The frequency of the modulation, the amplitude or depth of the modulation, basically how much contrast between bright and dark. The average intensity, the brighter the average, the easier it is to detect the flicker. The wavelength or wavelength range of the illumination. The position on the retina on which the stimulation occurs. There's a difference between our flicker sensitivity in the center of our vision, the fovea, which is very high detailed but slow, and our peripheral vision, which has very little detail but very quick. Now, this is counter to the idea that cones are located in the fovea, which are color sensing cells, are themselves very fast, but require more light than the rods, which are the black and white cells, excellent low light, but sluggish in response. If that's confusing, welcome to the world of human vision. The degree of light or dark adaptation, and finally, physiological factors such as age and fatigue. So for everyone saying the human eye can see an infinite frame rate, the fact that you can sit in a room with a fluorescent light, or that you can dim the RGB lights in your computer case and not see it strobing on and off, is proof that no, you do not indeed see frame rate, and certainly not an infinite frame rate. But you know what does see frame rate? Video cameras. And the issue of strobing is a common pitfall when shooting under these lighting conditions. We have to counter it by adjusting our shutter speed so that it matches the refresh rate of the strobing light. And sometimes it's a matter of a few degrees of shutter angle. Okay, so that concludes the easy mode of this discussion with basic, concrete, objective numbers. Now I'm just going to crack the door just slightly into how the brain handles motion perception. The Wagon Wheel Effect. If you've been around a frame rate discussion, you might be familiar with the Wagon Wheel Effect. The phenomenon is called stroboscopic effect, which Wikipedia defines as visual phenomenon caused by aliasing that occurs when continuous rotation or other cyclic motion is represented by a series of short or instantaneous samples, as opposed to a continuous view at sampling rate close to the period of the motion. Whew, that is a jargon-rich sentence. Let's break that down. Now, you've seen this effect in the spokes of wheels in car ads or wagons in old westerns. Essentially, you have a repeated motion that is sampled in a camera in such a way that the repeated motion comes back to the same position when it's sampled again. This effect shows up famously in frozen helicopter blades or spouts of water when shot with a camera with a very high shutter speed, which freezes the motion, and when the frame rate matches the motion. You can also simulate this effect using fast strobe lights, an effect that is most dramatically seen in the 3D zoetropes like this one from Pixar. The strobing light occurs above the flicker fusion threshold, so it looks like it's continuously on, but it's really not. It's a very cool effect, but this kind of stroboscopic effect requires some sort of strobing, whether that's in the form of a camera's frame rate or strobe lighting. Now, there is a form of subjective stroboscopy that is visible with the human eye under continuous light. And this was studied by J.F. Schouten in 1967. Probably screwed that name up as well. He used a series of black and white plates driven by a turntable in his studies and identified 3 forms of this subjective stroboscopy, which he labeled alpha, beta, and gamma. Alpha stroboscopy occurs around 8 to 12 cycles per second. The spinning wheel becomes stationary. It looks kind of close to our Bloch's law in 5 phenomenon numbers, right? 8 to 12. Beta starts around 30 to 35 cycles, where the distinct pattern of black and white turn into a grayish striped pattern, which appears to reverse in rotation. And then gamma, which is 40 to 100 cycles per second, all the patterns turn into a standing gray. Now remember, this is under continuous light with the eye. No cameras, no strobing. But why would beta stroboscopy reverse direction? Well, 2 hypotheses emerged. The first was that the visual perception in the brain happens in discrete frames. This is proposed by Purves, Paydefar, and Andrews. Their evidence comes from reviewing experiences of people who used LSD and reported seeing moving objects having a series of trailing still images. When asked to select movies that simulated their LSD experiences, they picked movies between 15 and 20 frames per second, which is right between the alpha and the beta rates that Schouten discovered. However, there is a second theory. Remember our mantra? One that Schouten proposed and gained some more evidence and maybe closer to reality. This is called temporal aliasing theory. Now, in the science of motion perception, there are hypothetical neural circuits called Reichardt-Hassenstein detectors. As of now, scientists haven't actually modeled the mechanism of how they actually work in anything but a fly's eye. But the idea is this. These motion detector neurons evaluate signals from 2 neighboring photoreceptor cells. One of the signals is time delayed, such that the detector will only generate a signal when the stimuli is moving in a certain direction at a certain speed. With this model, we have Reichardt detectors for different directions of motion in our eye. So in the temporal aliasing theory, the motion of the wagon wheel confuses the brain because it activates Reichardt detectors both sensitive to the true motion of the wagon wheel and the reverse caused by aliasing. These detectors create a rivalry. This may not be a full 50-50 match, maybe something like 90-10. A key experiment came from Klein, Holcomb, and Eagleman in 2004 using dots on a rotating drum. In this video for Wired, Eagleman demonstrates how the motion of the drum can randomly flip after a certain period of looking at the rotation. Again, this is seen in continuous light, and at least for me, the effect works even when watching a video with a discrete frame rate. He explains it like this. You have detectors sensing both right and left motion, firing at the same time. But one motion dominates most of the time, and only after a significant amount of time of looking at it, you may see it flip to the opposite motion as the detectors for the opposite motion make enough of a case of the brain to cause that switch. Now, the breakthrough component of this experiment that provides evidence against discrete frame theory is when he introduces a mirror. Now you can see two mirrored copies of the motion. If discrete frame theory is correct, you would see both spinning drums flip at the same time. But this does not happen. When the drums flip in motion, they do so independently. In 2008, Klein and Eagleman conducted another experiment pitting two subjective stroboscopy movements in one spinning windmill experiment. The spinning blades also had a pattern that would grow and shrink. Now, participants would experience the image motion reversal either in the motion of the windmill or the pattern, the growing or shrinking pattern. But they very rarely saw both at the same time, which is further evidence against that discrete frame theory. So I guess we're back to our mantra. The human visual system does not have a frame rate. So 10 hertz, Phi phenomenon, Bloch's law, 50 to 90 with critical flicker fusion, alpha, beta, gamma frequencies for subjective stroboscopy, they all interplay and contribute to this mysterious phenomenon known as human vision. So when it comes to the frame rate of cinema, making a claim from the perspective of biology is, pardon the pun, very short-sighted. I'm sure my friends think I'm some level crazy when it comes to discussing frame rate of motion pictures. YouTube's algorithm is certainly an enabler, feeding me a lot of people angry at 24 FPS for some reason. But when I continually dig deeper into the topic, go past the bad arguments and start delving into the actual optical illusions, instead what I find is what it truly means to be human, to experience this world as a human, as a consciousness desperately trying to make sense of the limited information about the physical reality around him. And in that same sense, the more I watch movies, the more I experience the empathy machine, the more emotionally connected to all humanity I feel. The topic of frame rate and the cinematic experience are so intimately intertwined. If there's one thing I'm trying to do with this video, is dispel the biological argument in the frame rate of cinema. Biology responds to frame rate. It isn't defined by frame rate. And as such, there is no reason to adhere to a frame rate because it's what our eye sees. Remember, the eye has no frame rate. Our eye sees all frame rates, and they all have their look and feel. So we should approach frame rate for what it offers aesthetically. As such, cinema remains at 24 because it is aesthetically pleasing and culturally significant, or else we filmmakers wouldn't be making 24 FPS in virtually 100% of all motion picture products, from movies to streaming shows to even the ads that run on this YouTube channel. If you disagree, you're more than welcome to make your own movies at whatever frame rate you desire. And on the flip side, video games can take whatever frame rate your graphic card can muster because that too is aesthetically pleasing. Different mediums, different forms of expression, different frame rates. But every bad idea, every bad argument in this field comes from reductionism, the oversimplification of topics in order to make them consumable by the populace. Now, these models get built, such as the frame rate of the human eye, and draw tenuous analogies only to end up leaving us blind to how biology hopefully actually works. Well, we're still trying to figure that out. And it feels like we've reached the end of scientific revolution sometimes, where pop science no longer frees us from ignorance, but instead cages us with weak analogies, with false gods to justify bloody online crusades. I'm not just talking about frame rate here. Instead, I find beauty and wonder in the infinitely deep complexity of the universe, that there's still so much to explore and so much to learn. But that won't drive views like a nice clickbaity title. Like, subscribe, ring that bell. Thanks to the Patreon folks right here. If you want to drop a buck or two, that always helps, always appreciate it. Grab some merch below. Promise you, it's good in all frame rates. Until next time, go forth, make something great in any frame rate. I'm John Hess. I'll see you at filmmakeriq.com.